Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt. This is the last AM edition of the Hillsdale Dialogue that you will hear because we're moving to the PM beginning next week. But I am happy to have Dr. Habib back with us, Dr. Arnn back with us, because they are here to set straight that which I made crooked in our first episode. I got away from chronology, which is always dangerous. Dr. Habib, we're talking about the French Revolution and the American Revolution and why the two went so very, very differently. And we should have begun with Burke. Why was Burke suspicious of what was going on in France, even when there were some enthusiasts around him?
Burke thinks it's extremely dangerous for abstract ideas to find their way into politics. Burke was really a statesman who exercised extraordinary discernment and prudence. He never wrote a work of political theory per se, and part of the reason why he does that is because he doesn't want to encourage abstractions in the practice of politics. In his reflections on the French Revolution, he even tells us in the introduction that he was somewhat reluctant to even share his reflections. And so he does it in the form of a letter. So he makes it more conversational and less like a treatise. And I think that's the first sign of his prudence. Now, the reason why he didn't like the French Revolution is he predicted it would end in disaster. And the reason why he did that is because it was a revolution in terms of abstract rights, which he's not in favor of. He has a very different definition of rights. He believes in rights, but not in these abstract natural rights, whereas Tocqueville does. And so he thought that since the French Revolution was largely influenced by ideas of Rousseau, who he thought was a fanatic, he thought it was destined to just completely fail, and he was right about that.
But Burke was a fan of our revolution, or at least he urged patience in the Parliament concerning the colonists, did he not?
Absolutely. In fact, Karl Marx thought he was a hypocrite and couldn't explain why he, on the one hand, was critical of the French Revolution and on the other hand, praised the American. Marx, as a typical Marxist, attributed an economic incentive for him to do that. He actually suspected maybe Burke was on the take by some Americans and he wasn't, by the French. And that's just simply not true. The reason why Burke was in favor of the American Revolution is he believed that it was justified. He felt that what happened between Parliament and the colonists, i.e. the early Americans, was one of total tyranny, and it was totally justified for the Americans to actually break off. He thought Parliament had reached a point where it had codified its hatred of its fellow citizens, and there was no turning back or going back on that kind of fanaticism. England was hiring German mercenaries, for example, to hunt down Americans and kill them. They had gotten extremely belligerent and tyrannical, and Parliament had become a tyranny. Whereas Burke thought that the French had not reached that level, that when the French got to the point where they would behead their own royalty, something had gone wrong, that they had within their traditions examples of reform that would have moderated the passions rather than led to this bloodshed. And he believed that the French revolutions, the revolutionaries, were simply unjustified in there was no tyranny as such, like there was in the American. And he also thought that the Americans were really British who had experiences with political liberty, and so they would actually be successful. For Burke, he's a pragmatist. He thought that the French did not have that kind of experience and wouldn't be able to have a revolution and freedom, whereas the Americans were, of course, were able to do that. And so he was right on both accounts.
Now, Dr. Arnn, this week I will teach class number 1 in con law. It's actually the second class. First day is just, the stuff you have to do in the first day of class. And I always begin with a brief outline of you have to know the Jews, the Greeks, the Romans, the English, in order to have any understanding of the American Constitution. And one of the things we go over is the fact that the Brits were fairly experienced with bloody revolution in 1660 and a bloodless one in 1688. How much does that matter to Burke's development of his view of tolerance towards the colonists?
Well, Burke is not a despotic man, right? In the end, Burke thinks that tyranny is wrong because it abuses the rights of human beings, right? However they are born. So he's very traditionalist in some important ways, and I learned the meaning of the term mortgage once by reading Burke. He talked about tradition, locked as in a mort main, which means a death pact. That's what mortgage means too. So, yeah, he's very traditional. But in the end, just because you're well-born doesn't mean you get to slaughter or expropriate anybody. And so he's looking for a stability so that the country can operate without everybody eating each other, right? And he didn't think he'd get that in the French Revolution, and you didn't. By the way, shouldn't we, we're teachers here, right? The French Revolution lasts 10 years. Can I go through the steps, please?
Please.
Yeah. So it starts with the calling of the States General, which Louis basically does because he needs money and troops, on the 5th of May, 1789. And it lasts until Napoleon brings an end to it in November 1799, 1 decade later, right? And the States General convenes and they immediately start going crazy. They call themselves the National Assembly. They take control by October of that year. And remember, in 1789, what's going on in America? Our new Constitution is coming into effect in America. It's 11 years after the Constitution was written, 11 years after the Declaration of Independence. Now it's 13 years later, and George Washington is coming into office as the president. And so we're reaching our stability when all this starts. Now, in 1790, in the middle of the year, they declare a new constitution, and they more or less arrest the royal family. And that goes on for a year and a half. And then in 1792, they declare war on Austria and Prussia. And, I left out the storming of the Bastille in the first year. July the 14th is Bastille Day, 1789. That's when the violence starts. Right?
Yes.
So in 1792, they, more violent. They stormed the royal palace. They abolished the monarchy in September 1792. They killed the king in January 1793, and soon his wife. They declare war on Britain and Holland. Now they're fighting everybody. And in 1793, in the spring, they start killing aristocrats. And that's when you get the tumbrils, those little carts, dragging these aristocrats from prison off to get their heads cut off. If you want to get the tone of that and a sort of Burkean view of that from England, The Scarlet Pimpernel is a lovely little novel that's very worth reading, and there's a good movie made about it, too.
Is it better than A Tale of Two Cities? Because I think that's one of the greatest things ever written in terms of understanding.
Awesome. Yeah, The Tale of Two Cities is the same kind of thing. And there are good movies of The Tale of Two Cities, too. They're both really fine reads. And you get a sense because in England, they're horrified by this. And, they're related to some of these people who are getting their heads cut off. And the Scarlet Pimpernel is a spy, a British aristocrat, who goes over there and saves a bunch of them. Very artful. So they kill the king in 1793. Robespierre is the one who starts all this violence. He was a very radical guy.
He's a lawyer.
Yeah, there you go. God save us. There's war everywhere, too. And they're conscripting people into the army. And passions are running high. And they're executing people. And that goes on for a year. And it's interesting, Thomas Paine, who'd gone over there to join in all this stuff because it was his kind of deal, and he was in prison, and he was holding court, and he was marked for death. And he wasn't taken to on the tumbril to the guillotine because he had his door open, and they didn't see the mark on his door to take him the first night. And that night, Robespierre fell, and then he was executed in July of 1794. And after that, so now you're you're 4 years, 5 years into this thing, and there's been a lot of killing and a lot of war. And then basically the rest of it is Napoleon rising to power.
And Napoleon goes on with the killing for 15 more years. So from 1789...
Well, that's right, in war.
It's war. Pause for a moment. We'll be right back. Dr. Larry Arnn and I are talking, along with Khalil Habib, about revolutions, two of them, the American and the French, and what went very, very wrong with the latter. Don't go anywhere, America, except over to HughHewitt.com. Remember, next week at this time, the Hillsdale Dialogue will be at 5 p.m. on your Friday, not at 8 a.m. Stay tuned.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back, America. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined by Dr. Larry Arnn, Dr. Khalil Habib. We're talking about revolutions, both the American and the French Revolution. I was asking you about Napoleon, Dr. Arnn, when we went to break.
I'm interested in Khalil's view of Napoleon. I have been more resistant to the charms of Napoleon than Winston Churchill or our friend Andrew Roberts. But what does Khalil think about him?
Doctor?
I take Tolstoy's view on Napoleon. At the very end of War and Peace, Tolstoy has an essay on just history and statesmanship. And he wasn't a fan of Napoleon. Part of it was because he thought that he was really an extension of the French Revolution. He was a necessary consequence of the French Revolution. Somebody had to bring order to this chaos. On the other hand, he still remained very popular in the imagination of a lot of the young in Europe and even in Russia. And so on the one hand, Tolstoy recognized that Napoleon was necessary. When you have this kind of anarchy and this kind of bloodshed, there has to be some kind of firm hand to restore order. On the other hand, again, he was not a fan of Napoleon because Tolstoy believed that the times in many ways force these kinds of necessities on politics. And the idea that someone like Napoleon could be this great man who could just simply transform society was also a continuation of many of the excesses of the French Revolution itself. It over-exaggerated the role that human agency could play, and that's part of what led to the fanaticism of the French Revolution. It wasn't a revolution of compromise or institutional checks and balances. It was one of sort of a comic book view of somebody like a godlike hero like Napoleon. So I think I'm with Dr. Arnn on this. I'm very reluctant to be charmed by him for those reasons.
Well, I was very reluctant, but then I read the Roberts book, and he's a genius, and he's a very charismatic genius. I just don't want him to be my genius. I don't want him running my country. Doctor, let's go back to what I said earlier, Dr. Arnn. We have a revolution in Great Britain in 1660. Off with their head, the king dies. They have a second revolution in 1688. They don't kill the king. They let the king go into exile. Why is it that Great Britain's revolution and the one it spawned, our revolution, does not go off the rails into mayhem and blood? I mean, there's war, but there isn't mayhem and blood in the British revolutions or ours in the way that there is in the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution.
Not to the same. Both the French and the American revolutions are revolutions, and they did things like change how people talk to each other, right? No more my lord, now citizen in France. Citizen. And in this country, our Constitution forbids titles of nobility. That's a big thing, right? Because, today in England, our friend Andrew Roberts is the Lord Roberts, and of what's the name of the place? I forget, Belgravia. And he's got a title of nobility, and for the time being, and he hopes and I hope it persists, he is a legislator with some power because he's been appointed to a peerage. That's not popular consent. The king, the queen appointed him to that. So we discarded all of that. And the British, what they did kill one of their kings. And they abolished the monarchy for about a decade, I think, if I remember correctly. So all three things are revolutions. Ours was milder, and the mildest of them in a way. I mean, in another way, a lot of people lost their property. There's a lot of people living in Canada who are descended from people who didn't go along with the American Revolution today. And they fled,
But we didn't make them leave. They fled. There weren't any pogroms of the Loyalists.
Sometimes it was not too good, if you were a Loyalist. You might find a mob outside your house burning an effigy of the king and you, or the governor general. But it's also true that we had, first of all, we had a better quality of two things. We had more than anywhere on earth, I think, at the time, more than Britain, infinitely more than France. We had a citizen body used to governing themselves. And then we had a really remarkable group of statesmen. Extraordinary, right? In Britain, they had Burke and Pitt, who are both heroes to me, and they were both friends of the American Revolution, but they were not in the center of power under George III. The worst misjudgment he made, in my opinion, because if they had been in the center of power, we might be British today, in the way that the Canadians or the Australians are.
On that note, that is something to consider, especially given our current back and forth between the president-elect and Canada. But we'll dig more deeply into that. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. Come right back to the Hillsdale Dialogue. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Welcome back, America. The Hillsdale Dialogue is underway. Dr. Larry Arnn, Dr. Khalil Habib. I want to remind you all things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu and all prior Hillsdale Dialogues at hughforhillsdale.com. Question for Dr. Habib. How much of this is because we did have a frontier that presented an ever-present danger to whoever was living on the frontier? France did not have a frontier. England did not have a frontier. They had enemies, but they didn't have a frontier. How much of our country being a frontier figures into the, what is the word that Dr. Arnn just used, the placid, the word that you used to describe a revolution, much more prudential, I guess. Why is that?
Yeah, it was more, right. They had more population. They exported a lot of people. And they didn't figure out, Winston Churchill, who's not nothing, his account of all that, by the way, is that by the American Revolution, the British actually figured out how to run their empire. And that, they didn't understand at the George III. He didn't understand, one of my favorite stories from the American Revolution is that they sent various people to London to talk. When the revolution in America started in 1763, when the British decided to get hands-on with us, they never had been, right? And so there's friction right away, and they send various people, and they can't. So they send Ben Franklin, and they thought Ben Franklin was a man who could make a deal with the lamppost, and he's going to go over there and talk to him and sort it out. And he gets over there, and he talks to the people in charge over there, Lord North and such people. And I can't remember exactly which one it was said. I think it might have been Lord North, might have been Townshend. He said, "You are the children and we are the mother, and you must do what we say." And Ben Franklin's missive back, accounting that early conversation, was, "There's going to be a war." Because we're not going to do that, right? And that's that because we were not used to anybody talking to us that way, right? And, just think of the massive respect that George Washington gathered, because he's, one of the greatest men who ever lived, and everybody knew that and loved him and trusted him completely because he didn't want power, right? That's why he got so much of it. And so when it's over and he's the president now, what are we going to call him? And John Adams says, we should call him His Majesty. And everybody else, including George Washington, thought that was funny. And Alexander Hamilton, and Gouverneur Morris, who were a couple of wits, they started calling John Adams His Rotundity. And Washington, there were people who wanted Washington to be the king. Washington wanted to be Mr. President. See, that's...
I'm reaching around because I'm looking for a book by Peggy Noonan that came out for Christmas in which she writes about the friendship of Jefferson and Adams. And this is a question for Dr. Habib. She says they part over the French Revolution. At heart, the great good friends and fellow revolutionaries who went through war and danger together end up breaking over the French Revolution. Jefferson thought it was a good thing. Adams thought it was a horrible thing. Is she right in her account?
She is right about it. I mean, and one reason I think Jefferson was more sympathetic is early on, Jefferson was smitten with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's a lot of fun to read until you take a step back and realize he's insane. And I think Adams was far more sober. I just want to get back to you. One point that Dr. Arnn made that was really good, the differences between those two revolutions. This was several points back. The French Revolution, the way Tocqueville presented it, as it was a progressive revolution. It was the first progressive revolution in the history of the West, according to Tocqueville, whereas the American and English revolutions were revolutions that were organic and moved by prudence. Institutions were in place to help them effect a moderate transition from tyranny to settling back into liberty. But so I just wanted to point that out. And then the other question you had about the frontier, to the best of my knowledge, Burke doesn't say much about that. Tocqueville does point out that the frontier did have some impact on the American mind, but it wasn't crucial in the success of the American Revolution. He focused far more, like Dr. Arnn did, on the character of the American founders. He loved the Federalists. He thought the Federalists were America's unique set of geniuses and America's sole sort of political philosophy, so to speak, because it was not a philosophy written pie in the sky. It was ideas matching lived experience, moderated by prudence. And so I think he focuses far more on just the character and the history of the Americans than the frontier. What he says about the frontier is a little bit unrelated to the American Revolution.
Dr. Habib, what does he say about Lafayette coming to America's aid and being quite instrumental, and then going back to France? And he's kind of a ditherer, as I read my French history. He really doesn't know what to do at any given time. Does Tocqueville have any commentary on the great patriot on our team and the guy who's essentially failed the French people?
Right. No, not that I'm aware of. I think Tocqueville really tries to present America as sort of on its own terms. And part of the reason why I think he does that is he wants to really spotlight how unique it is and how unlikely it will ever be replicated again. He does not want the American Revolution to have inspire other revolutions that will only end up resembling the French Revolution. I know that sounds kind of weird, but his basic point is that what America produced was unique to it and the character of its citizens. He points out at some point in Democracy in America that the Mexicans copied word for word the language of the Declaration and the Constitution, and he said it only strengthened its oligarchy and it didn't lead to anything. So he doesn't want to spotlight Lafayette. He doesn't want to connect it to the French in any way, shape, or form. He connects it far more to its Lockean and British roots. And he wants it to be treated unique onto itself, that it can be an inspiration to others, but what happened in the United States is not likely to be replicated anywhere else. And if we lose our freedom, you're not likely to regain it.
Let's conclude there in about 8 minutes. Dr. Arnn, you said last week that the conditions that preceded the American Revolution are no longer in place in the United States, which is local governance and local decision-making producing prudence that then is bottom up. is it likely to return?
Well, that's the endeavor that's underway right now. We're in a drama now, a world historic drama. I've been saying for a decade now that this is like the 1850s, and we were on the verge of a revolution in the 1850s because the claim was that we should institutionalize slavery and send it out into the vast lands of the West and keep this a slave country. And, that was the radical view, and the moderate view was Stephen Douglas's view that we can just let localities decide, which means we're neutral on the question of human freedom. And then the other radical view, the one that won, was Abe Lincoln's view, Hillsdale College's view back in that day, right? So this is like that. In the late 19th century, a kind of government was invented, beginning in Germany, but coming to America pretty quick. And that kind is ruled by expertise, coordinated, centralized planning to bring the scientific method to bear upon our daily lives. That's sort of a fair summary of what happened. And that won a majority in 1932 in America, and it has, since 1960 especially, that's when the big movement was made. And you can see that if you just go to Washington, D.C., and walk around and look in central Washington, D.C., and look for ugly buildings and pretty buildings. They're very easy to distinguish, and look at the dates of their building.
I just did that because I was down at the National Mall to see the new exhibit on Paris 1874, and we walked around the J. Edgar Hoover building, and Fetching Mrs. Hewitt and I both agreed it needed to be demolished. It's absolutely brutalist. It's the worst. It's the ugliest building in Washington, D.C., and it's, of course, a modernity. It's a product of our modern age. Dr. Habib.
My friend Roger. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say they should build a new FBI building, and they should build it in Kansas City. That's Roger Kimball, our friend's recommendation in an article today. Or, maybe Ant Farm, Nebraska.
Someplace with snow. Someplace with snow. Dr. Habib, are you an optimist about the American Revolution and its original purpose, or are you a pessimist?
No, I'm completely optimistic. I think if you had experience living in another part of the world, especially something as drastically different as the Middle East and America, the first thing that you're struck by is the incredible resilience of the American people. I think there are times when things get really ugly. You can easily despair. But I think the most recent election is an example of these institutions working. They don't always work, but I think the American people are far more dialed in to ideas and politics than any other people I've ever lived among. And I think this recent enormous victory by Trump and all of the realignments that it reflects, I think just shows how even immigrants who come to this country and once they get settled in, quickly absorb what is in their interest in terms of prosperity and liberty and what is not.
Pause right there, Dr. Habib. I wonder what those immigrants are thinking about California this week as it burns down, and whether or not they made a good choice to walk to such a dystopian future. We'll find out maybe after the break. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. Your reminder that next week, the Hillsdale Dialogue moves along with me to the afternoons on Friday. But we won't miss a single Hillsdale Dialogue. They're all at hillsdale.edu and Hugh for hillsdale.com.
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844.
Welcome back, America. I'm a pretty depressed person after the week we've gone through in California, and I'm wondering, Dr. Arnn and Dr. Habib, let's start with you, Dr. Habib, about whether or not you are optimistic about the course of our revolution as it stands right now.
So I am absolutely optimistic. However, I do think we need to institutionalize the Trump revolution, and we have to do our part, and that is to actually get actively participating in politics. It's not enough to just say, hey, our Napoleon has come and now he's going to take care of everything for us. We have a role to play. And I think we can lend support, whether in terms of writing articles or teaching, or just outright just getting involved in politics and shaping the public opinion. I love it. I'm absolutely optimistic.
We do not want a Napoleon, nor do I think Trump aspires to be, though the left attributes that to him. I am an optimist for this reason. I want to get a closing comment from Dr. Arnn. If there is a single retirement from the left wing of the court, one single more, the Constitution will be safe for as long as you and I are going to be around, at least, and probably for 50 or 60 years. Do you agree with that, that the Constitution, there are 6 originalists now, 5.5 if you don't like Roberts. I like Roberts a lot, so I think there are 6. Do you think that with one more that the original idea of the Constitution is back, and with it a vibrancy in the American politics?
Well, you know, how the 400 years that you and I have been talking, you've always overestimated the importance of lawyers. So the point is, if politics turns in a certain direction, we are inches away from them packing the court.
True.
And the Supreme Court is a great thing, and right now I like it a lot. But don't overestimate its, because it doesn't have contact with the proper sovereign, it's indirect. And that's why Hamilton writes that it's the least dangerous branch. And so this idea that it'll be safe for X, it'll be safe, right now we're down to this. The American people are the only thing that can save the country, and that's right, that it should be so. And it looks like they may be inclined to do that.
And that's what they did.
That's what they did. Well, they did so far. And that it's like what I said before. I think Donald Trump is a very serious statesman and a man of courage and persistence and clear ideas. But I've thought that since 2015 when I watched him say them to a bunch of people, and I went, wowie. But the people have responded. And remember, one of the things that's going on is that we're vagifying who is the electorate, and we're importing millions of people illegally into the country. And that's an attempt, it is likely to have the effect, and therefore you have to read it as an attempt to take over the electorate, which is something the King of England did that's complained of in the Declaration of Independence. He expanded the borders of Quebec, which he had just given them a new constitution that he liked better, and they put up with it, so that some of what had been eventually United States, the American colonies, become part of Canada. He was choosing the electorate he wanted.
But as Dr. Habib just said, newcomers to the United States quickly become enamored of that which they did not have in their old countries, which is liberty. And so that's maybe those 10 to 20 million people will quickly become the spinal cord of a re-energized attachment to liberty.
It depends on if the country continues to operate, right? In other words, what is it to come to America? My late brother-in-law, Peter Saram, a great man, he was a Hungarian immigrant. And he, at age 9, is the one who made the decision for the family whether to come, because mom and dad were of different opinion about it. So they punted it to the boy. And what happened then? His father, Willie, was in the textile business. He built a business in Southern California. He worked 14 hours a day for the rest of his life. He made a living. Toward the end of his life, he bought himself a Cadillac. and took it over to Europe and drove it through the village in Hungary, still a communist village, so everybody could see, right? In other words, if America operates like that, then how your opinions end up got nothing to do with your color. It's how you live, right?
Exactly.
And we're
on that note, Dr. Arnn, you have to go to your meeting, and we are out of time on the Hillsdale Dialogue. I do want to thank Dr. Habib for putting up with us for a couple hours, and please do come back. We'll have to figure out what the encore is for this, but you've encouraged us, which is sometimes not the result that we get on the Hillsdale Dialogue. We're often despondent. So thank you, Dr. Habib. We're often despondent, but not really. We love the Hillsdale Dialogue, and they are moving with us. Dr. Arnn will be back next Friday. I'm going to be also, Dr. Daniel O'Toole will be back. We're going to go do and finish up the Plato's Republic, and then we're going to launch ourselves into Marlboro, because we need to be lifted up by great leadership. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. The Hillsdale Dialogue is moving along with the Hugh Hewitt Show to the afternoons in the East and the noon to 3 hours in the West. And you can listen to every Hillsdale Dialogue by going to hughforhillsdale.com. More importantly, head over to hillsdale.edu right now. Sign up for Imprimis. Sign up for any of their great video courses. Tell people about Hillsdale College. It is the bright, shining lantern of the North, way up there in that Team Up North state, and it's a wonderful place. Hillsdale.edu, hughforhillsdale.com. Thank you all for listening for the 8 years. Join me on Monday in a new time slot on the next Hugh Hewitt Show.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.